In the wake of a mass shooting, there is one thing that politicians love to do, and that's instead of look at the problem with a critical eye, with visions of proactive work, instead, just blame video games. Sure. Let's go back to that old cherry, despite there being a 2011 Supreme Court case that ruled that video games are protected by the First Amendment. And it's just my opinion, but I don't think the First Amendment should be sacrificed for the Second Amendment. But that's just me.
Correct.
There's also several research studies that have shown that there is no connection between violent video games and real-world violence. There have been a few debunked studies that said that, but oftentimes we are looking at evidence that shows contrary to what the popular claim is, that guns and video games translate to the feeling that you can shoot people in real life. There have been studies that have shown that video game spikes of high popularity of violent video games coincide with dips in crime. There have been studies that don't show any connection whatsoever between the two. Oftentimes, playing video games or spending too much time in video games is a symptom of something else rather than the cause of violence.
Right. There are two warring factors here. One is sense and reason and actual scientific backing. And the other is this desire to blame something that isn't your role boy.
Oh, I was going to say the other one is money.
The other one's money, and that all kind of goes under the same umbrella. There is this idea that that there's a problem when you see a number of school shootings, when you see a spike in the perception of a spike in school shootings is very obvious to everybody. The instinct to say, well, there must be a reason for it. You can very easily identify that, but then no one wants the reason for it to be something they like.
No, you want it to be convenient.
Exactly, and I can say for me, someone who likes video games, it's convenient for me to say that video games aren't the problem. For someone who likes guns, it's convenient for them to say that guns aren't the problem. And a lot of people then would take the next step to blame the other that isn't their role boy. However, the video games have the actual facts on their side to say that the video games aren't the problem.
No, they're not connected to real-world violence whatsoever. Despite that all, President Trump has announced he will be taking action this week despite not voting on anything or looking at any sort of bills or policy. Sarah Huckabee Sanders has spoken on his behalf on his major plans to address real-world gun violence, saying the president has met with a number of stakeholders. Next week, he'll also be meeting with members of the video game industry to see what they can do on that front as well. This is going to be an ongoing process and something that we don't expect to happen overnight, but something that we're going to continue to be engaged in and continue look for the best ways possible to make sure we're doing everything we can to protect schools across the country. Everything, though? Are you sure it's everything? So the crux of that, if you ignore the part about everything, is that they're going to talk to prominent people in the video game industry, maybe the ESA, maybe big pillars of the industry that lead where trends go, except no one told them. The ESA and our member companies have not received an invitation to meet with President Trump, as have certain other companies in the industry, leaders such as EA, Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft. No one seems to have received any kind of invitation to speak about video games at the White House. Who could they possibly mean then?
I watch a lot of press conferences. I do a segment where we do fake press conferences where if they actually answer the question, what it would be like if they used honesty. And the wording from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, if you looked at certain things like, this is not something we expect to happen overnight, this is an ongoing process, they just want to say it. She just wants to say it. And then she wants to put little flags up so that you know that this is not something you should expect really any results on. And they think they can use this generic term like we're going to speak with the video game industry and that will somehow satiate everyone's desire for something to be done when
But that's a ridiculous assertion. That's like if I were to blame a company that makes teddy bears for recent bear attacks in the world.
Right, but The ridiculous assertions, there are many of them, specifically the one where the president sat down and said there should be ratings for these video games.
Except the ESRB has existed for decades now and has been doing this since then.
Right, and it's like, of course he doesn't know any of that. Can you picture Donald Trump going through, and the experience that I had growing up, like going through Toys R Us or GameStop with Barron and buying games for him?
But listen, it's just like if you don't even know there's a rating on each video game and it's been there for over 23 years, what right do you have to even say that this should be in the conversation whatsoever?
The right that he has is that he's the president and he says a lot of things. And you can look at his MO.
That's not a right, that's just a precedent.
Right, but his MO is to say the kinds of old saws and adages that you hear from, old guys like him. That sounds super ageist, and I don't mean that all old people say stuff like that, but it is the kind of thing you expect folks to say, and it is the kind of lip service that he pays. It's when you say something like he says, like there should be ratings for these, I think it's the video games. I think they're getting these ideas by going to the movies and nothing's like it used to be. That fits exactly into the narrative he crafts of make America great again. Things were better in the old days.
What, when video games didn't exist?
When video games didn't exist, but then again, you mentioned those studies that show that over the time when video game playing and usage are at all-time highs and the demographic skews older and older every year and it just becomes absolutely the mainstream. It's not even that discussion that it's kind of mainstream. It is ridiculous for him to say these kinds of things and he doesn't stop it.
Well, we go over this again and again, and it's that these statements are not only not fact-based, but are completely ignorant of the topic in general.
Yeah.
Like you could have at least looked at the Wikipedia for this, and you didn't even do that. When we were going back in time, and I've mentioned this again and again, but it's always whatever people don't understand. Maybe to your point, the older generation doesn't understand. And a long time ago, there was the Hays Code for comic books, where comics had to have certain moral standards, otherwise the youth would be corrupted. There were movies that way. In the 80s, Tipper Gore was blaming the satanic panic and rock and roll for the deviancy of youth. It's so stupid and tone deaf, especially when we've looked at this for years now, when we've had many expensive court cases, federal court cases on this, when we've had all this precedent and still it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and
it's crazy.
Not to mention the hypocrisy of saying we need to have these things to be more regulated when the one thing that he's been against very vocally is regulation. And the fact is that these do have the same kind of rating system that we have when we look at movies, and it's been there for a very long time.
Audience, what are your thoughts on this? Please let us know on Facebook and Twitter.